On March 16, 1984, Gary Plauché waited for Jeff Ducey at the airport. This man kidnapped and sexually assaulted his son Jody, and then Gary shot him dead while news cameras filmed the whole incident.
Gary Plauché is now in arm's reach of his son's suspected abuser. With his camera, Aiden McGull videotapes what happens next. A shocking close-range shooting after Gary Plauché takes aim.
These are some of the craziest revenges ever caught on camera. It's March 18th, 2021, and police stumble upon a gruesome discovery in downtown Tlaquepaque, in the Mexican state of Jalisco. A lifeless body, tightly wrapped in plastic, was left sitting on a park bench. At first glance, police thought it might be a mannequin because of how tightly it was bound and how distorted the body was. But the smell of decay and the blood-stained note pinned to the chest with 2 knives told a far grimmer story. The note read in Spanish, "The traitor, El Cholo." Police knew exactly who this man was. He's been on their most wanted list for far too long. Now, his real name was Carlos Enrique Sanchez, better known as El Cholo, and he was the former leader of the Nueva Plaza Cartel. And because of this, they knew the death wasn't just random. It was a message. Well, he himself was the message, a public display of what happens to those who betray one of Mexico's most dangerous cartels. But now, if you don't know, you must be wondering, who could take down a cartel leader like El Cholo? To understand this, we need to talk about the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG. Now, the CJNG is one of Mexico's youngest cartels, but they're incredibly feared by literally everyone because of their sheer brutality and unprecedented influence. The Mexican government ranks them as one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the country, second to Sinaloa. And the U.S. Department of Justice also considers it to be one of the top 5 most dangerous transnational criminal organizations in the world and America's biggest criminal drug threat. 2009, the cartel began as a branch of the Milenio Cartel, and in just a few years, it transformed into one of the most dangerous, fastest growing, and richest drug cartels in Mexico. From 2018 to 2020 alone, the CJNG engaged in 298 reported acts of gang-related violence. This was more than any other cartel in the country. And well, their leader is the one who sets the tone for them. His name is Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, better known as El Mencho. Now, he once worked as a policeman in Jalisco before deciding that playing on the other side of the law was far more profitable. Early in his criminal career, he served time in a U.S. prison for drug-related crimes. And after being deported to Mexico, he climbed through the ranks in the criminal underworld until he finally formed the CJNG. And now he's one of the most wanted criminals by both the U.S. and Mexican governments. In fact, he is accused in the U.S. of drug trafficking, corruption, and murder, and there's a staggering $10 million reward for his capture. But seriously, why all the fuss over just one man? Well, as I already said, El Mencho sets the tone for this entire cartel. His violence isn't just a means to an end. It's a sick pleasure, a twisted form of entertainment. And this specific attitude trickles down to the rest of the cartel, influencing their tactics and way of operations. So for over a decade, the CJNG has spread destruction throughout Mexico with their gruesome acts of mass killings, acid baths, decapitations, and even the horrifying practice of cannibalism used during their training of their new sicarios. So now that you know how brutal the CJNG can be, do you think it's a great idea to turn your back on them? Well, we personally don't think so, but our man El Cholo thought he could outsmart him. Now, believe it or not, El Cholo was once a loyal member of the notorious CJNG. Some say he was even El Mencho's right hand. However, power and greed led him to break away from the CJNG in 2017. And well, he didn't just leave the cartel. He would order the execution of El Colombiano, the financial operator for the CJNG, who was the one to discover El Cholo's shady dealings, and threatened to inform El Mencho. In turn, El Cholo would work on forming his own gang, the Nueva Plaza Cartel. It was founded by the CJNG's #1 enemy, the Sinaloa Cartel. And just like that, the two organizations began battling fiercely over Mexico's western states for years, causing destruction and shedding innocent blood everywhere. That was until El Mencho decided that he'd had enough, and El Cholo must be brought down, no matter the cost. March 18, 2021, a video surfaces online showing a man in a red Lacoste shirt sitting in a chair, shoulders slumped, eyes sunken, as if he knew he was condemned, and, well, he really was. Behind him stood several masked men, armed to the teeth and giving a chilling hint about what was going to happen to him. This distraught man, later identified as El Cholo, began speaking, his eyes darting off to something behind the camera as if he were reading whatever his captors wanted him to say. He first took responsibility for the numerous violent incidents across Mexico, including an attack on the U.S. consulate. He also named several top police officers who he claimed had been working with him to bring down the CJNG. Now, one name stood out: Omar Garcia Harfuch, a controversial cop known for his ruthless tactics and unwavering determination to take down cartels. In 2020, Garcia Harfuch narrowly escaped an attempt on his life that was allegedly orchestrated by the CJNG. And despite being heavily injured during that attack, he refused to break down and publicly blamed the CJNG and would issue a statement saying, "Our nation must continue to confront cowardly organized crime." But when El Cholo's video went viral, Harfuch was quick to deny all claims, posting on social media that he wouldn't pay attention to the words of a criminal kidnapped by criminals, as if he knew for certain who was behind El Cholo's murder. At the end of the video, El Cholo, his voice trembling and nearly on the brink of tears, urged his supporters to stop following in his tracks and to dedicate more time to their families. His final words were, "Look how I ended." On May 16, 1992, one of the most haunting moments in the history of Mexican music takes place at Salón Bugambillas in Culiacán, Sinaloa. Mid-performance, Chalino Sanchez was handed a folded note by someone in the crowd. He paused, smiled as he opened it, wondering if it was a compliment or maybe a message from a fan. But the minute he saw what was written, his demeanor shifted, and people could see the fear in his eyes just for a moment before he crumpled the paper, shoved it into his pocket, and carried on singing like he didn't read anything. Now, many believe that note was a death threat, a warning that the night would end in blood, and it did. Let's go to August 30th, 1960. Chalino Sanchez was born in El Guayabo, a small farming municipality in Sinaloa, on the ranch called Las Flechas. Now, he was the youngest of 8 children. Sadly, his father passed away when he was only 6, and despite growing up in this impoverished community that had very few resources and was frequently exposed to violence, Chalino managed to develop an incredible level of resilience from a very early age. And against all odds, he not only survived, but also thrived, eventually becoming one of the most influential figures in narco corrido music, traditional Mexican ballads that told raw, emotional stories of crime, loyalty, and loss. But before all that, Chalino faced his share of life-altering challenges. Because let's face it, resilience in a place like Sinaloa often came with a price. And at just 15 years old, he was forced to make a choice that would forever alter the course of his life. Chalino had shot and killed a man who had sexually assaulted his sister. He then fled to Tijuana and eventually crossed the border into the U.S. In California, Chalino wore many hats. He worked as a farm worker, a dishwasher, car salesman, and even a small-time drug dealer. Not only that, but he would also help his older brother, Armando, run an immigrant smuggling operation. Now, this operation was cut short in July 1984 when Armando was shot and killed in Tijuana, which inspired Chalino to compose his first corrido. Shortly after, he was imprisoned for several petty crimes in La Mesa prison, and there he kept making corridos and found that it was actually profitable too. So his fellow inmates, often illiterate drug traffickers, paid him in cash, watches, and even firearms to immortalize their lives in a song. And after his release, Chalino would begin recording his corridos. He sold cassettes out of his car trunk, performed at baptisms and quinceañeras, and would slowly build a name and a loyal following for himself. His songs were unapologetically real, narrating the lives of outlaws and the heavy prices they paid. But here's the thing. Chalino wasn't just a musician singing about such stories. He lived them as well. January 25, 1992, during a performance at the Plaza Los Aros in Coachella, California, a man named Eduardo Gallegos climbed on stage while Chalino was singing and opened fire. Chalino didn't hesitate and pulled out his gun and shot right back, adding to the chaos. In total, Gallegos shot 4 bullets. 2 of them hit Chalino in the chest, near his armpit, striking his lung, and the other one hit the accordionist in the thigh. Meanwhile, Chalino's shots had missed Gallego, but accidentally hit and killed 20-year-old Claudio Rene Carranza, an innocent bystander. Despite the tragedy, this incident turned Chalino into an icon, a singer who didn't just sing about crime and danger but faced it head-on. However, with this newly found fame, he would eventually have a target on his back. And Chalino knew it was going to happen. He was well aware the life that he sang about came with consequences, and he eventually started fearing for his life. He would distribute his gun collection amongst his friends, and even sell the rights to his music catalog to ensure that his family would be taken care of. It was like he knew the day was near, and sadly it was. But aren't you wondering why anyone would target a singer? Chalino's corridos often glorified or memorialized cartel figures and drug traffickers, telling their stories in vivid detail. These songs earned him not just fans but powerful patrons as well, men who saw Chalino as their personal bard, immortalizing their lives or even dangerous deeds in his songs. But this connection was often a double-edged sword. You see, while some cartel leaders adored him, others felt misrepresented by him, or even offended and disrespected by him, praising their rivals. And well, it's not totally surprising that constantly singing about dangerous men in a world governed by fragile egos, violent tempers, and even a thirst for revenge was always a gamble. One wrong lyric, and it's a death sentence. And that's just what happened. On that fateful night in May 1992, right after his performance, Chalino left the venue with 2 of his brothers, a cousin, and several women. Soon their vehicles would be intercepted by armed men in black Chevy Suburbans. The men pull up to Chalino's vehicle and claim that they were state police. They tell him that their commander wanted to see him. Without protest, Chalino steps into one of their vehicles. That following morning, his body is found near an irrigation canal. His wrists were bound, eyes blindfolded, and he'd been shot twice in the back of the head. It was an execution, a cold and brutal act meant to silence him forever. One theory says that Chalino may have sung about or even refused to sing about someone powerful, which may have caused resentment. Another theory speculates that he was caught in the crossfire of rival cartel factions, each fighting for dominance and control. Doesn't really matter though, because Chalino was added to the never-ending list of lives lost to the brutality of cartels. He was buried in Sinaloa, where he was born, and to this day, his songs continue to echo across Mexico, keeping his story alive. The mystery of who wrote that note, who ordered his death, still remains unsolved. But one thing's certain, Chalino Sanchez didn't just sing stories. He became one. It's April 18th, 2008. Gunshots are erupting outside the health ministry in the Montebello residential district of Culiacan. Not long after, Manuel Fidel Torres Felix, better known as LM1, received the news that would shatter his life. His 20-year-old son Torres Acosta had been brutally killed by sicarios from the Beltran Leyva cartel. Torres Acosta had been ambushed alongside his sister Alondra and their aunt, Rivas Heredia. Initially, the sicarios had tried to kidnap him, but Torres Acosta fought him back. In retaliation, they ended up shooting him dead on the spot. The gunfire would leave Alondra wounded in her arm and shoulder, while their aunt had suffered a gunshot to the leg. Now, little did these sicarios know that what would follow next was utter and absolute mayhem, one that would eventually catch up with them. You see, that moment marked the breaking point for LM1. The loss of his son didn't just devastate him, it awakened something far darker and more sinister. LM1 wasn't interested in simple retaliation or even measured revenge. No, he wanted an all-out bloodbath. And to truly grasp how dangerous the situation had become, you first need to understand who exactly LM1 was, and why was his wrath something to fear. In the 1990s, LM1 had just joined the Sinaloa cartel, and it wouldn't take long before he started rising through the ranks. After his brother Javier Torres Felix, who had led one of the cartel's factions, was arrested, LM1 took charge and soon began collaborating with Ovidio Guzman Lopez, the son of the infamous El Chapo. Together they oversaw massive drug trafficking operations from South America into Mexico. And during this time, the Sinaloa cartel and the Beltran Leyva organization, or BLO, were allies, coexisting in the small state of Sinaloa. But in 2008, that alliance fell apart. The BLO, driven by greed and a lust for power, decided to split off. And so the two cartels clashed, each fighting for dominance over what used to be their shared turfs. What followed was inevitable: violence, chaos, and bloodshed on an unimaginable scale. And LM1, who was by now a prominent leader of the Sinaloa cartel, finding himself in the eye of this storm. And soon the murder of his son became the catalyst for one of the bloodiest chapters in this conflict. In the days following Torres Acosta's death, LM1 ordered his men to capture as many members as possible of the BLO or even their Los Zetas allies. They were then brought to his ranch, where the true depth of his psychotic nature began showing itself in full view. Each of these captives would be subjected to unimaginable torture for days before being executed. One particularly gruesome incident involved a guy named Roberto Carlos Barcelo Villagran, a municipal police commander. LM1 took his back and sliced it open with knives. His legs were severed, and then finally, he was beheaded, all while he was alive. So they take his mutilated body, along with two other guys, and stuff it into the trunk of a car. Then they take those bodies and scatter it across Culiacan for everyone to see, turning the city into a grim exhibit in the nightmarish Museum of Death. Yet, all of these atrocities weren't enough to satisfy LM1. His thirst for vengeance knew no bounds. He tortured over 30 sicarios himself and ordered the execution of hundreds more. His brutality soon earned him the nickname El Ondeado, meaning the crazy one. However, despite the chaos he was causing, LM1 remained as calculated as ever. He knew he was wanted dead or alive by that point, so he rarely left his hometown and ensured that most of his horrendous acts happened on his personal ranch. Not only that, but while all this was happening, in the background he was still collaborating with El Mayo and El Chapo's son to keep the cartel's operations running smoothly. But the Mexican authorities weren't sitting idly either. Culiacan had become a scene of horror. Bodies were littered everywhere, and fear haunted every single one of its citizens. So they knew they had to do everything in their power to put an end to LM1, and would send over 2,000 troops to achieve just that. And they did. October 13th, 2012, LM1 was killed in a gun battle in the community of Ose Viejo in Culiacan, Sinaloa. His reign of terror was finally over, but the city and everyone who lived through it would always remember the scars of his endless thirst for revenge. It's also a powerful reminder of just how far a parent will go when their child is taken away from them. And he's not the only story we'll see in this video. March 6, 1981. In a German courtroom, Marianne Bachmeier, a 31-year-old mother, pulls out a pistol and fires 7 shots at Klaus Grabowski, the man accused of molesting and murdering her daughter, Anna. Now, this act of revenge captured headlines worldwide, sparking endless debates about the fine line between justice and vengeance. Some saw Marianne as a bereaved mother who did what any parent would feel was right, while others had believed she'd crossed a line that could never be justified. But before you form an opinion on that debate, you need to understand who Marianne was and what pushed her to take the law into her own hands, even when Grabowski was already in custody. Let's go to June 3rd, 1950. Marianne's born in Sarstedt, a small town in West Germany. Her parents sought refuge there from East Prussia after the Second World War. Sadly, Marianne wouldn't have a very happy upbringing. You see, when she was a teenager, she was sexually assaulted and had to give her baby away for adoption. But then she became pregnant again at the age of 18 by her boyfriend. Yet she would be the victim of another assault shortly before the birth of her second child, and she put up her second baby for adoption as well. Now, when she became pregnant with her third child, Anna, Marianne was then determined to keep this one, and for a time they would share this happy and nurturing life in Ubec, where Marianne ran a local pub. But fate would have another tragedy in store for Marianne, because on May 5th, 1980, the peaceful life that she shared with her daughter had crumbled. Following a very heated argument with her mom, Anna decided to skip school that fateful day and somehow found herself in the hands of her 35-year-old neighbor, a local butcher named Klaus Grabowski, who already had a criminal record for child molestation. Now, investigators later found out Grabowski had kept Anna at his home for hours before he strangled her with his fiance's pantyhose. He then stashed the body in a cardboard box and left her on the bank of a nearby canal. That same evening, though, Grabowski's fiancée grew suspicious and alerted the police, which led to his arrest. And while he was quick to admit to the murder, Grabowski denied any sexual abuse, claiming Anna had tried to blackmail him. He alleged that she had threatened to tell her mother that he had abused her if he didn't give her money. And so Grabowski, being an ex-convict, knew nobody would believe him, panicked, and killed her. The twisted and sick excuse was like adding fuel to an already blazing fire in Marianne's heart. And when Grabowski went to trial for Anna's murder a year later, Marianne knew she couldn't stand still and hear him lie through his teeth about her daughter in court. And so, on the third day of the trial, Marianne smuggled in a Beretta 80 into the Ubec District Court and shot Grabowski in the back, firing 7 times and hitting him 6. He died almost instantly, and Marianne lowered her gun, surrendering without resistance. Witnesses that day described her as calm yet determined, with Judge Gunther Kroger recalling her chilling words. November 2, 1982, Marianne stood trial for murder. She revealed that she had dreamt of that moment ever since the day her daughter was killed. A doctor who examined her said that Marianne was asked for a handwriting sample, and in response she would write, "I did it for you, Anna." She then decorated that sample with 7 hearts, perhaps one for each year of Anna's life. She would also express her outrage at Grabowski's claims, stating, "I thought now comes the next lie about this victim, who was my child." In the end, the court had no choice but to find Marianne Buckmeyer guilty of premeditated manslaughter and sentenced her to 6 years in prison. However, she was released after serving only half of that sentence. She would then move to Nigeria, where she married and remained until the 1990s. After her divorce, though, she would relocate to Sicily, where she stayed until she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, upon which she returned to Germany. September 17, 1996. Marianne sadly passed away at the age of 46 and was laid to rest beside her beloved Anna. And now the question is yours to answer. Was Marianne's act an unforgivable crime or a mother's desperate pursuit of justice? March 17, 1984. Gary Plauché stood in the arrivals hall of Baton Rouge Metropolitan Airport, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes and sunglasses hiding his face. He was waiting for Jeff Doucet. When police officers finally led the man through the terminal, Gary steps forward, pulled out a gun he had snuck into the airport in his boot, and fired a single shot at Doucet's head. All the while, news cameras were rolling. But to truly understand what led Gary Plauché to this moment, we have to go back a few weeks earlier, to the day his world fell apart. Gary Plauché was an ordinary man, a father, a husband, a U.S. Air Force veteran, and even a local salesman. He would work hard to provide for his family, and he lived a quiet life in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. But on February 19, 1984, everything changed. His son Jody had just finished a karate lesson with his instructor Jeff Doucet, who offered him a ride home. Now, Doucet wasn't just a teacher, he was seen as a family friend, and so when Jody called his mom, June, to get her permission, she agreed instantly. After all, she had really no reason to doubt Doucet. But Jeff didn't plan on taking Jody home. Instead, he took him to the bus station. And the next thing we know is that he's heading on a bus to Anaheim, California. Along the way, Doucet would shave his beard and dye Jody's blonde hair black to avoid suspicion. Then they check into this cheap motel near Disneyland. And in that room, Doucet sexually assaults Jody. But despite the fear gripping him, Jody somehow found the courage to ask Ducey if he could call his parents. And for some wild reason, Ducey allowed it. That call would lead authorities straight to him. Ducey was arrested, and Jody was flown back to Louisiana. Now Gary, of course, was relieved to have his son back, but he was also haunted by guilt and rage. After all, his son had been violated and betrayed by someone they had trusted, and he had little faith in the justice system to punish Ducey enough.
We were scared, and our reaction was just erratic at times. We just, didn't know what to think. It's just a waiting that, I don't know, it's a lot of waiting. We didn't know what to do. You just feel helpless.
In the days following Jody's return, Gary couldn't shake the thought of Ducey walking free or harming another child. He spent hours at a local bar, the Cotton Club, drowning his sorrows and asking anyone who'd listen, "When is Ducey coming back to Baton Rouge?" By sheer chance, a former colleague from WBRZ News overheard Gary's questions and would mention that Jeff Ducey would arrive on March 16th on American Airlines Flight 595. That was all Gary needed to know. And on that fateful day, as Ducey was led through the terminal, he was completely unaware of the impending doom waiting for him. In the blink of an eye, Gary pulls out his gun and shoots him in the head. And as chaos erupted, a police officer, a friend of Gary's, tackles him to the ground and proceeds to handcuff him while shouting at his friend, "Why, Gary, why?" And through tears, Gary replied, "If somebody did it to your kid, you'd do it too." Now, Gary was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. But something crazy happened. The people of Baton Rouge had already made up their minds. To them, Gary wasn't a cold-blooded killer. He was a grieving father who acted out of love and rage. Local bars would raise money for his legal defense. Strangers offered donations to help with his bail. And people spoke out in his support, saying he was a father who acted out of love for his child, not hatred. During the trial, though, Gary's attorney would argue that the trauma of Jody's kidnapping had pushed him into this psychotic state, where he couldn't fully comprehend his actions. In the end, Gary Plauché received a 7-year suspended sentence, 5 years of probation, and 300 hours of community service, and he never served a single day in prison. After the trial, Gary quietly faded from the public eye. He returned to a relatively normal life again, carrying with him the weight of what he had done and the love he had for his son. In 2014, Gary had sadly passed away from a stroke at the age of 68. His obituary described him as a man who saw beauty in everything, was a loyal friend, made others laugh, and was a hero to many. As for Jody, he took that pain and turned it into purpose. In his book, Why, Gary, Why, he shares his side of the story to help parents prevent their children from ever having to experience what he went through.